The bottle hit the table, the laughter kept climbing, and one Marine went very, very still. Somewhere over the middle of the country in the quiet hush of first class, a nurse in a plain gray cardigan was about to be humiliated in front of 40 strangers. She had no idea a man 3 rows back had already clocked every detail about her, from the calluses on her hands to the faded ink on her wrist. What she stood to lose was more than her dignity. It was the version of herself she had built to survive. What was about to happen next would not just protect her. It would remind an entire cabin what quiet strength actually looks like. Stay with this one, because the man who was about to stand up had a past most people would never guess just from looking at him, and by the time this flight landed, nobody in that cabin would ever laugh at a tired nurse again. Her name was Dana Whitfield, and on the morning this story begins, she had been awake for 19 hours straight. She worked nights in the burn unit of a regional hospital, the kind of ward most people never think about until someone they love ends up there. She had spent her shift changing dressings on a young man who had been pulled from a house fire, holding his hand while he cried and telling him in a calm, steady voice that he was going to get through this. She believed it even when the numbers said otherwise. That was who Dana was. She believed people could get through things because she had gotten through her own. Dana was 34 years old. She had short brown hair she kept pinned back for work, and eyes that looked tired in the way that only comes from years of caring for people at their worst moments. She lived alone in a small rented house 2 miles from the hospital with a dog named Biscuit and a garden she barely had time to water. Her mornings were simple. Coffee, a shower hot enough to loosen the knots in her shoulders, and a slow drive home while the sun came up over flat fields. She rarely spoke about her past. Most of her coworkers assumed she had always been a nurse, always been soft-spoken, always been the one who volunteered for the hardest shifts because nobody else wanted them. They were wrong. Before nursing school, before the burn unit, before Biscuit and the little garden, Dana had worn a different uniform. She did not talk about that chapter of her life. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because most people did not know what to do with it once they heard it. It made them look at her differently, and Dana had spent years trying to be looked at normally again. So she kept it folded away, the same way she curled the small tattoo on the inside of her left wrist folded under a plain silver watch. Most days, nobody noticed it at all. On this particular week, Dana was flying to see her sister get married. It was the first vacation she had taken in 2 years, and her supervisor had practically forced her to use the days. She had booked the cheapest ticket she could find, but a scheduling mix-up at the gate bumped her into first class instead, an apology from an airline employee who felt bad about a delay. Dana almost declined it. She was not used to nice things being handed to her without a catch. But she was exhausted, and the idea of a wider seat and a little more quiet sounded like mercy after a week that had drained her down to the last inch. She settled into seat 2C with her bag tucked under the seat in front of her and closed her eyes almost immediately. She did not notice the man in seat 5A, dressed in plain civilian clothes, reading a paperback with the quiet stillness of someone who had spent a career learning to sit motionless for hours at a time. She did not notice how his eyes moved once briefly toward her wrist when her sleeve slipped back. She did not notice anything, because for the first time in a long time, Dana allowed herself to rest. The trouble did not start right away. It built slowly, the way trouble on a plane often does, in small comments and sideways looks before it ever becomes something loud enough for a stranger to have to respond to. And that first hint, the one small thread that would eventually pull the whole cabin into a moment nobody expected, came from 3 rows up from a group of men who had boarded loud and stayed loud, the kind of men who filled a space before anyone even asked them to. If this story is pulling you in already, tap that like button so it reaches someone who needs a reminder that quiet people carry the loudest strength. The men who boarded in first class that morning came on like they owned the plane before it ever left the ground. There were 4 of them, all in their late 20s or early 30s, dressed in expensive but careless clothes, the kind that said money without saying taste. Their leader was a man named Trent Calloway, the son of a regional real estate developer, flying home from a golf trip with 3 friends who laughed at everything he said a half. Second too fast, the way people laugh when they are trying to stay in someone's favor. Trent took the aisle seat directly across from Dana. He smelled like cologne applied with too heavy a hand, and he had the kind of loud phone voice that made everyone around him feel like an audience whether they wanted to be one or not. His friends settled in behind him, still laughing about something from the golf course, oblivious or indifferent to the fact that most of the cabin was trying to rest. At first, Dana barely registered them. She had learned long ago how to tune out noise, a skill built over years of chaotic emergency rooms and short-staffed night shifts. She kept her eyes closed, her arms folded, her breathing slow. But Trent was the kind of man who noticed when someone was not paying attention to him, and something about that seemed to bother him more than if she had been staring. He nudged his friend beside him and made a comment about her cardigan being something out of a thrift store clearance rack. It was not loud enough to be a real insult, more of a testing comment, the kind bullies use to see if a target will flinch. Dana did not open her eyes. She had heard worse from grieving families and drunk visitors in the emergency room. A stranger's opinion about her sweater was not going to register on her radar. That non-reaction seemed to annoy Trent even more. He liked reactions. He liked being noticed, being feared a little, being deferred to. It was how he had spent his entire adult life coasting on his father's money and his own loud confidence, never once earning the respect he assumed he was owed. When people did not fall in line quickly enough, something in him tightened like a rope pulled taut. The flight attendant came by with drinks, and Trent ordered for the whole row without asking his friends what they wanted, a small detail that told its own story about who he believed himself to be. When she reached Dana, Dana asked quietly for water. Trent made a comment about how boring that was, and his friends laughed the practiced laugh again. Dana still did not open her eyes, though a small crease formed between her brows, the first sign of tension building somewhere she was trying to keep buried. The man in seat 5A did not laugh. He had not laughed once since boarding. He turned a page in his book, but his eyes lifted just slightly, watching the row across the aisle the way a person watches weather building on the horizon, calm on the surface, already calculating what might come. His name, though nobody in the cabin knew it yet, was Marcus Reyes. He was 51 years old, silver at the temples, built like a man who had spent decades staying in shape out of habit rather than vanity. He wore reading glasses low on his nose and a plain navy jacket that gave away nothing about his past. To anyone glancing at him, he looked like an ordinary businessman traveling home. That was exactly how he preferred it. Marcus had retired 2 years earlier after nearly 3 decades in the Marine Corps, most of it spent in roles the public would never read about in any newspaper. He had commanded Marines in some of the hardest years of 2 different wars, had buried friends, had carried wounded men across ground that should have swallowed them both. Since retiring, he worked quietly as a consultant, flew often, and had trained himself over the years to notice everything in a room without ever seeming to look directly at it. Old habits did not fade, they simply became quieter. He had noticed Dana the moment she sat down, not because of her looks, but because of the way she moved, economical and controlled, the way people move when they have spent years conserving energy for emergencies that could happen at any second. He had seen that walk before in medics, in corpsmen, in nurses who had learned to function on almost no sleep. When her sleeve slipped and he caught a flash of ink on her wrist before her watch slid back into place, something in his memory sparked, faint but unmistakable, like a signal from a long time ago crossing his mind again. He did not say anything, not yet. He simply kept reading, kept watching, and let the situation in front of him keep unfolding, the way a good commander lets a threat show its full shape before deciding how to respond to it. If you are the kind of person who notices the quiet ones in the room too, drop a comment and let me know, because this story is about to prove you right. By the time the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the tension in the cabin had thickened without most passengers even realizing why. Trent Calloway had grown bored of being ignored by the tired woman across the aisle, and boredom, for a man like him, always curdled into something sharper. He leaned across the aisle and asked Dana, loud enough for his friends to hear, what she did for a living, the question wrapped in a tone that suggested he already expected the answer to be small and unimpressed. Sive, Dana opened her eyes at last, meeting his gaze evenly, and answered simply that she was a nurse. Trent repeated the word back like it amused him, then made a comment about how nurses probably enjoyed getting bumped up to first class for once instead of standing all day for minimum wage. Dana's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed level. She corrected him gently, explaining that nursing was not minimum wage work and that she worked in a burn unit, which meant 12-hour shifts holding people together, sometimes literally, while they fought to survive their worst day. She did not say it for sympathy. She said it as fact, flat and steady, the way she might explain a diagnosis to a frightened family member. Trent's friends went quiet for a second, the kind of pause that happens when a joke lands wrong. But Trent did not back down. Instead, he doubled down, making a comment that nurses were basically glorified assistants to real doctors and that anyone could learn to change a bandage. It was a small, careless cruelty, the kind said more to save face in front of friends than out of any real belief. Marcus, 3 rows back, closed his book completely now. His eyes had not left the interaction in several minutes. He recognized the particular flavor of cruelty coming from Trent, a cruelty built entirely on never having been tested, never having carried anyone else's weight, never having stood in a room where someone's life depended on the steadiness of your hands. He had commanded men who mocked things they did not understand too, usually right up until the moment those very things saved their lives. Dana, for her part, did not raise her voice. She simply said quietly that she had held the hands of 11-year-olds while doctors debrided burned skin, that she had learned to keep her own voice calm even while her own heart was breaking, and that if Trent ever ended up in a hospital bed, he would be grateful someone like her was there. It was not an angry statement. It was almost sad, delivered with the exhaustion of someone who had defended her profession to too many people who would never understand it. Trent laughed it off, waving a hand dismissively, calling her dramatic in front of his friends, who laughed along out of habit rather than agreement. One of them, a quieter man named Doug, looked uncomfortable, glancing toward the window instead of joining the laughter. Not everyone in the group was cruel. Some were simply too weak to say otherwise. The flight attendant, a young woman named Priya, approached to offer a second round of drinks and visibly hesitated at the tension radiating from the row. She asked carefully if everything was all right. Trent answered for the whole row, saying everything was fine, that they were just having a laugh. Dana said nothing, staring down at the tray table in front of her, the muscles in her jaw working slightly as she reined in more than a decade of practiced patience. Marcus watched Priya's face as she walked away, saw the flicker of concern there, the powerlessness that came from being an employee trained to de-escalate rather than confront. He understood that feeling too, the frustration of protocol keeping a person from acting on instinct. He had felt it himself more than once, waiting for the right moment instead of the first moment. And then the room changed. It did not change loudly. It changed the way weather changes before a storm, a stillness settling over certain seats, an awareness moving through the cabin even among people who could not have said exactly what they were sensing. Something was building, something was about to give. If this story has you gripping your seat already, go ahead and subscribe, because the next 20 minutes are where everything turns. Trent, emboldened by the lack of real pushback, kept going. He made another comment, this time about Dana's tattoo having caught the edge of it when her sleeve rode up again as she reached for her water. He asked in a mocking tone what a nurse was doing with ink like that, implying with his tone that it did not belong on someone so soft-spoken, so plain, so unremarkable in his eyes. Dana's hand instinctively moved to cover her wrist, an old, practiced motion, the same one she used at work when she did not want to explain her past to curious coworkers. But this time her hand paused halfway there. Something in her had reached its limit, not enough to explode, but enough to refuse to hide any longer. She looked directly at Trent and told him calmly that the tattoo was not his business. Her voice had an edge now, steel underneath the softness, the tone of someone who had commanded a room full of panicking family members and knew exactly how to hold her ground without losing control. Trent, sensing an opening, leaned further into his cruelty, mocking her tone, calling her sensitive, telling his friends to watch out because the nurse had claws. One of his friends, encouraged by the laughter, made a comment of his own, something about how women who got tattoos like that were probably trying too hard to seem tough. It was a small, thoughtless comment, the kind people make without thinking about who might be sitting close enough to hear it and understand exactly what it meant. Marcus understood exactly what it meant. He had seen that tattoo before, or one nearly identical to it, on the wrists of a very specific group of people who had gone through one of the hardest medical training pipelines in the military, a program that trained combat corpsmen and battlefield nurses to work under fire, stabilizing the wounded in conditions most hospitals would never dream of operating in. The design was subtle, easy to miss unless you knew what you were looking for. A small emblem worn quietly by people who did not typically explain what it meant unless someone truly needed to know. Marcus set his book down completely now, folded it closed on his lap, sat up straighter in his seat. He had not moved this deliberately in a long time. His body remembered exactly how to shift from stillness into action, the same controlled transition he had trained into hundreds of young Marines over the years. Calm did not mean passive. Calm meant ready. Dana's composure was beginning to crack, not into anger, but into something quieter and more painful. She had spent her whole adult life being underestimated, first as a young medic in a war zone where men twice her size doubted she could carry a stretcher, and now as an exhausted nurse in a plane full of strangers who saw her cardigan and her tired eyes and assumed there was nothing more to her than what was on the surface. She had learned to let most of it go. But being mocked for the one mark on her body that represented the hardest, most important years of her life struck a different kind of nerve. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breathing the way she had been trained to do under fire, and when she opened them again, there was no anger there. Only tiredness, the deep kind that comes from defending your worth to people who will never understand what you have carried. That was the moment Marcus stood up. He rose slowly from seat 5A, unhurried, the way a man moves when he has all the confidence in the world and none of the need to prove it. He walked the short distance up the aisle, past curious eyes, past Priya frozen mid-step with a drink cart, past Trent's friends who suddenly stopped laughing without quite understanding why. He stopped beside Dana's row, close enough that his presence filled the space the way a taller shadow falls over a shorter one. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply looked at Trent, his eyes calm but absolutely unwavering, the same look he had once used to steady young Marines seconds before stepping into gunfire. He asked Trent quietly if he knew what that tattoo meant. Trent, caught off guard by the sudden presence of a stranger standing over him, stumbled through a dismissive answer, saying it was probably just some trendy design. Marcus shook his head slowly, and something in the gesture made the entire row go silent. He said that the tattoo belonged to a very small group of people trained to keep Marines alive in the worst places on Earth, people who worked through blood and fire and screaming while everyone else ran the opposite direction. He said he had served with people who wore that mark, that he had watched them save lives that should have been lost, that he had held the hand of men going into surgery in the field because someone with that exact tattoo told them they were not going to die that day, and kept that promise. The cabin had gone completely silent now. Passengers who had been trying not to listen were listening openly. Priya stood frozen, drink cart forgotten, hand pressed lightly against her chest. Marcus turned his eyes to Dana for the first time, his expression softening slightly, and asked her directly whether she had served as a combat corpsman. Dana hesitated, the old instinct to hide rising in her chest, but something about the steadiness in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he already knew the truth, made lying feel pointless. She nodded once quietly and said she had served 2 deployments before going to nursing school. Marcus asked her call sign. The question hung in the air, small and enormous at the same time. Dana's eyes glistened, not from sadness, but from something closer to being seen for the first time in years by someone who understood exactly what that word cost her to say out loud. She answered quietly, and the moment the word left her mouth, something shifted in Marcus's face, a flicker of recognition so sharp it looked almost like pain. He said her call sign had saved his life once, years earlier, halfway across the world, though she had never known his name and he had never known hers beyond the radio traffic that connected them for one single, unbearable night. He explained in careful, measured words that he had commanded a unit pinned down under heavy fire, that a corpsman with that exact call sign had crawled across open ground to reach one of his wounded Marines, had kept that boy breathing through 2 hours of chaos with nothing but her hands and her training and a refusal to let him die, had got him onto the helicopter that carried him home alive to his family. The cabin was utterly silent now, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Dana's hand rose slowly to her mouth. She remembered that night too. She remembered the mud, the screaming, the impossible weight of a boy nearly her own age slipping in and out of consciousness beneath her hands. She had never learned what happened to him after the helicopter took him away. She had spent years wondering in quiet, unguarded moments whether he had lived. Marcus told her the boy's name. He told her he had grown up, married, had 2 children now, ran a small hardware store outside of a town most people had never heard of, and that not one single day of that ordinary, beautiful life would exist without the hands that had refused to let him bleed out on foreign ground. The plane, the argument, Trent, all of it seemed to fall away for a moment, replaced entirely by 2 strangers realizing they had once been connected by the most important night of both of their lives without ever knowing each other's names. If you feel that chill running down your spine right now, that is exactly why stories like this one matter. So leave a comment and tell me where you were when it hit you. For a long moment, nobody in first class moved. Trent sat frozen in his seat, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by the specific kind of silence that comes from realizing you have humiliated yourself in front of an audience far larger than you intended. His friends stared at their laps, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes, least of all Marcus's. Marcus did not gloat. He did not raise his voice or demand an apology. That was never his way. He simply turned toward Trent one final time and said evenly that the woman he had spent the last hour mocking had spent her 20s doing something most men twice her size could never survive, and that the tattoo he had made fun of represented more courage than most people would ever understand in their entire lives. He said it plainly, without cruelty, the way a man states a fact rather than delivers a punishment. But the words landed harder than any insult could have. Trent's face went pale, then red, the specific color of a man realizing all at once exactly how small he had made himself look. Priya, finally able to move again, stepped forward and asked quietly if everyone needed anything, her voice trembling slightly with the aftershock of what she had just witnessed. Dana shook her head gently, still absorbing the fact that the boy she had saved on the worst night of her military service was alive, married, running a hardware store, laughing with his children on ordinary evenings that existed only because she had refused to give up on him. Marcus asked if he could sit for a moment, gesturing to the empty seat beside her, the one that had been empty since boarding. Dana nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak much, and he lowered himself into it with the same unhurried calm he had carried up the aisle. For a while they simply sat together in silence, 2 strangers bound by a memory neither had ever expected to revisit. He told her more about the boy, about how he had struggled for a long time after coming home, about the nights his own family had feared they might lose him to the invisible wounds instead, about how slowly, painfully, piece by piece, he had rebuilt a life worth living. He told her that the boy did not know her name either, that he had only ever spoken of the corpsman who stayed, the one who refused to let go even when everyone around her said it was hopeless. Dana listened with tears sliding silently down her face, not the tears of grief, but the strange, overwhelming relief of finally learning that the worst night of her life had produced something beautiful on the other side of it. She had spent years wondering if any of it mattered. Now she knew. Around them, the cabin had shifted entirely. Passengers who had said nothing during Trent's cruelty now looked at Dana with something like reverence. An older woman too rose up, reached over quietly and squeezed Dana's shoulder as she passed toward the restroom. A young father traveling with his son leaned over and told his boy, in a hushed voice, to remember this moment, to remember what real strength looked like. Trent did not say another word for the rest of the flight. His friends, particularly Doug, looked increasingly uncomfortable in his presence, the earlier laughter now feeling hollow and embarrassing even to them. Trent stared out the window, his jaw tight, the silence around him heavier than any punishment Marcus could have delivered with words. Marcus eventually returned to his own seat, but not before telling Dana quietly that she never owed anyone an explanation for that tattoo again, that some marks were not meant to be understood by everyone, only respected. Dana nodded, wiping her eyes, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. If this story is teaching you something about the people you overlook every day, hit that subscribe button, because there is another story just like it waiting for you next. The rest of the flight passed differently than it had begun. The energy in first class had softened, the way a room softens after a storm finally breaks and the air clears. Dana sat quietly by the window, watching the clouds stretch out beneath the plane, her wrist no longer hidden beneath her sleeve. For the first time in years, she did not feel the need to cover it. Priya returned partway through the flight with a small glass of orange juice, setting it gently in front of Dana without being asked, her eyes warm in a way that said more than words could. She told Dana quietly that she had a brother who had served, and that watching this unfold had reminded her of him. Dana thanked her, her voice still a little rough from crying earlier, and the two women shared a brief, understanding smile. Trent kept mostly to himself for the remainder of the flight, his earlier confidence replaced by a subdued quiet that seemed to weigh on him more than any argument could have. At one point, he glanced toward Dana, as if considering an apology, but the words never came. Some people need more than one uncomfortable flight to learn a lesson that deep. Whether he ever fully absorbed what had happened in that cabin was not something Dana needed to wait around to find out. When the plane began its descent, Marcus leaned across the aisle one more time and told Dana that he would like to put her in touch with the boy she had saved if she was ever open to it. He explained that closure like that did not come along often, and that the boy, now a grown man with a family of his own, deserved the chance to thank the person who had made his entire life possible. Dana agreed immediately, her eyes glistening again, this time with something that felt almost like hope. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, and the cabin filled with the familiar shuffle of passengers gathering bags and standing too early despite the seatbelt sign. Dana remained seated a moment longer, taking a slow breath, feeling lighter than she had in longer than she could remember. The exhaustion from her shift the night before was still there, tucked somewhere beneath her ribs, but it felt different now, less like a weight and more like proof of a life spent giving everything she had to people who needed her. As passengers filed off the plane, several of them offered quiet nods or small words of thanks to Dana as they passed, strangers who had witnessed something they would likely tell their own families about that night. An elderly man paused just long enough to shake her hand, telling her simply that his own son had served and that people like her did not hear thank you nearly often enough. Dana accepted each moment with quiet grace, her tiredness now mixed with something warmer. Marcus waited for her near the gate, offering to help carry her bag, an old habit from decades of never letting the people around him carry more than they had to. As they walked through the terminal together, he told her a little more about his own life after service, about the quiet consulting work he did now, about how moments like this one, rare as they were, reminded him why all those years had meant something. Dana told him about her sister's wedding, about Biscuit waiting for her at home, about the burn unit and the young man she had held the night before, the one who still had a long road ahead of him. Marcus listened the way people listen when they have spent a lifetime understanding how much unseen work goes into simply getting through a hard day. Before they parted ways at the terminal doors, Marcus handed her a small card with a phone number written on the back, telling her it belonged to the boy from that night so many years ago, now a grown man waiting, without knowing it yet, for the chance to finally say thank you. Dana held the card carefully, as if it might disappear if she gripped it too tightly, and thanked Marcus with a simple nod that carried more weight than any long speech could have. If a moment like that would mean something to you too, take a second to like this video, because stories about quiet people finally being seen deserve to travel further. That night, after checking into her hotel and calling her sister to confirm plans for the wedding rehearsal, Dana sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, turning the small card over in her hands. She thought about the mud, the noise, the boy's frightened eyes staring up at her all. Those years ago, certain he was going to die on foreign soil far from everyone he loved. She thought about how she had promised him, in a voice steadier than she felt, that he was not going to die that day, and how she had spent years afterward wondering if that promise had actually held. Now she knew it had. She dialed the number slowly, her heart pounding in a way it had not in a long time, not out of fear, but out of the strange vulnerability of finally closing a loop that had stayed open inside her for over a decade. When a man's voice answered on the other end, unfamiliar yet somehow instantly recognizable in the cadence of someone who had once depended entirely on the sound of her voice to survive, Dana introduced herself simply as the Korsman from that night. There was a long pause on the other end, then the sound of someone exhaling shakily, the sound of a grown man realizing all at once that the voice on the other end of the line belonged to the person who had given him every single day he had lived since. He told her, in halting words thick with emotion, that he thought about that night often, that he had never stopped wondering who she was, that his children knew the story even though they did not know her name. He told her he owed her everything, and Dana, sitting alone in a quiet hotel room hundreds of miles from home, finally let herself believe that the hardest year of her life had truly meant something. They talked for nearly an hour, trading pieces of their lives the way people do when a shared history suddenly becomes personal again after years of distance. He told her about his hardware store, about his 2 children, about the ordinary joys of Saturday mornings and school recitals, and a life he had once been certain he would never get to live. Dana told him about nursing school, about the burn unit, about the quiet satisfaction of helping people rebuild themselves one day at a time, much the way she had once helped him. By the time she hung up the phone, Dana felt something settle inside her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. The tattoo on her wrist no longer felt like something to hide beneath a watch or a long sleeve. It felt like proof, quiet and permanent, of exactly who she was and everything she had given. The wedding the next day was beautiful, full of laughter and dancing and the particular warmth of family gathered together after time apart. Dana wore a simple dress, her wrist bare for the first time in years, the small emblem visible whenever she raised a glass or reached for her sister's hand during the vows. Nobody at the wedding asked about it. Nobody needed to. She wore it the way she had earned it, quietly, without apology. Back home weeks later, life returned to its usual rhythm. Night shifts, quiet mornings, biscuit waiting by the door, the burn unit with its mixture of heartbreak and hope. But something in Dana had shifted permanently. She no longer flinched when a coworker noticed her tattoo. She no longer rehearsed a defense in her mind before someone could ask. She had learned on a crowded flight thousands of feet in the air that some marks are not meant to be explained. They are simply meant to be respected. Somewhere else, in a small town with a hardware store and 2 children who liked hearing their father tell the same story every year around the holidays, a man raised his coffee cup each morning, a little more grateful than the year before, never forgetting the steady hands and steadier voice that had once refused to let him go. And somewhere over the clouds, on flights that came and went every single day, ordinary people kept boarding planes carrying stories nobody around them would ever guess, quiet histories folded beneath plain sweaters and silver watches, waiting patiently for the rare moment when someone finally noticed. If this story reminded you to look a little closer at the quiet people around you, that is exactly the kind of reminder worth carrying with you long after the screen goes dark.